Hi everyone, I'm Subhashish Sahu, Head of Marketing at FinFloh. Welcome to the fifth episode of AI in Finance, a podcast where we explore the perspectives of finance leaders on how AI is transforming finance teams and reshaping the way the office of the CFO functions. In today's episode, Building Smarter Finance Teams with Data, Governance, and AI, I'm excited to speak with someone who has built and led data driven finance transformations at some of the world's most complex organizations, right the way from Autodesk to Visa. Joining us today is Abhishek Chandna, currently Director of Finance Strategy and Governance at Visa. Over the past decade, Abhishek has driven large scale automation and analytics initiatives across the finance landscape, from leading over 50 automation deployments to saving thousands of manual hours to building data governance frameworks that actually work. His expertise spans both strategic vision and operational execution. Today, we'll dig into the real world lessons behind finance automation, pick his brains on why data governance is often the missing piece, and how modern finance teams should be thinking about AI beyond the buzzwords. Let's dive in. Welcome, Abhishek. How have you been?
Thank, thank you, Subhashish. That was a very warm and kind introduction. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Okay, Abhishek. So before we actually dig into the crux of the conversation, right? Like I would love to know, like you have worked across like one of the most transformative finance teams, right? Like right from Autodesk to Visa, right? So would love to know your journey so far. How has it been?
Yeah, perfect. Happy to speak about it. So,
Yep.
Subhashish, I'm currently working at Visa, where I'm helping
Mm-hmm.
teams set up the finance data strategy and governance aspects of the work. My
Mm-hmm.
previous experience was with Autodesk, where I was heavily involved in setting up finance transformation initiatives, being at the center of data, tech, automation, and AI.
Right.
Throughout my professional experience, I've worked as a BI and analytics consultant, got the
Mm-hmm.
chance to work as a software engineer. So my happy trifactor is data, AI, and automation. That's a field that I'm super passionate about. And that's what made me super excited about this podcast, where we go beyond the buzzwords, I would say, and speak mostly about the real, sometimes the messy part of finance transformation. So
Right.
definitely looking
Right.
forward to it. Thanks, Subhasis.
Definitely. Yeah, sure. Very well said. I think we'll move on. It's been a very pretty extensive career that you have had. Like, what were the key challenges that you have seen finance teams face when they have been trying to adopt automation or any sort of data led decision making process? So, what's your point of view
Well, that's a great question, and one that I've definitely seen
there?
pan out across teams and across organizations for sure. I'll say the three big challenges, in my opinion. The first one is definitely the huge resistance that you face from people on the
Right.
change aspect of it. What that means is people start building things in silo. One
Mm-hmm.
big issue that happens with automation, data led work is you want to avoid building things in silos as much as possible. And you want to kind of ensure you have alignment with all the regions, with all the impacted stakeholders upfront. And I
Right.
feel that's where individuals face a lot of challenge in terms of the change management aspect of it. The second big challenge that I've seen is individuals and teams working off a broken or an inefficient process.
Okay.
The repercussions of that is individuals start automating chaos. One good quote that I always reflect on something whenever this conversation happens is the quote that I remember reading in one of the finance journals where Deloitte said that you automating a bad process is just speeding up the entire failure process. They kind of
Well
mention
said.
that it's your classic putting the cart before the horse problem. So once one needs to be careful about it, and I've seen that teams getting stuck on automating the chaos part of it as a big second roadblock that I've seen. And
Okay.
the third one is an interesting one, right? There are instances where sometimes tech becomes a roadblock. What I've also seen a big roadblock is too many tech options because then they get jump into the piece, should I choose this tool versus that tool? And I always encourage the teams to think about it, move away from a tech first mindset and move towards an outcome first mindset.
Okay.
Really hone in on what business problem you're trying to solve, what outcome you're trying to achieve, and the tech decision follows naturally over that. So
Got
I'd say those are three roadblocks that I've seen companies and teams face, but I think we will have solutions in place.
it. Definitely. Yeah, I think very well put together, Abhishek. And I'll resonate with the fact that you said that there are three different problem statements that companies often face, because we have also been talking to a lot of finance leaders who have been trying to automate their functions, right? And pretty much the answers that you gave are aligned with what we hear from them as well, right? And it is often the mindset which is related to change management, right? That whether or not people are ready to accept the new technology or the new solution that is being imposed upon them, because people are always comfortable in the way they are working right now, right? So any change that happens is always a roadblock. But it depends on the leaders who are incorporating this change as to how they make their teams understand the value of this transformation project, the value of the automation that it's bringing with itself, right? And that is what actually creates the difference. Leaders who are able to convince their teams that this project or this new solution can actually help you make your work easier and help you become more productive, rather than probably the biggest fear that these people probably have is that with this new technology coming into the picture, probably this might impact my role, or this might impact the exact way that I had been functioning for the last decade that I was working in it. So yeah, completely resonate with your points there.
Wonderful perspective,
Yeah,
Subhasi. The way you
correct.
put it, I
Yeah.
cannot reiterate, and you'll see that as a theme as I go through speaking
Mhm.
about it, is the importance of change management along the journey, right? You
Correct,
really
correct.
need to bring the users along.
Yeah,
Otherwise, any of the work you're doing is not going to be helpful. So thanks
correct,
for
correct.
summarizing it so
Definitely.
perfectly.
And you also correctly pointed out that once users are aligned and once people understand what the output of this exact initiative is going to be, like technology always follows that. And technology is never the barrier. It's always about whether or not they would be willing to change the way they are working.
That's so true.
Okay, amazing, cool. We'll move ahead, and now we'll talk a little bit about, like, I'll just try to pick your brain into the automation initiatives that you have been a part of, or the automation initiatives that you have done throughout your career, right? So, based on your experience or learnings from what has gone good or what has gone bad, can you just help us understand, like, how does a successful automation initiative actually look like, or what are some of the best practices that leaders can follow when they're planning towards such an initiative? Yep. Over to
Love
you.
the question. And I'm going to actually piggyback on what I just said. So I'm going to just
Okay.
sprinkle in some of the pieces that I've already said. But I
Mm-hmm.
always think of a successful automation as a 5 step process.
Okay.
First, and the most important thing is to really find a strong business pain point.
Got it.
What I always tell the teams are, do not automate for the sake of it. Do not
Mm-hmm.
build a dashboard just because it's fancy.
Right.
Build an automation that solves a real business pain point, a real business need. It need not be the most fanciest one, but it needs to be the most impactful one. So, really
Correct.
starting with honing on the business problem first is, in my opinion, the most critical first step. Once you have the business problem nailed down, I think the next logical step is you starting to look at your process end to end and really standardizing it. You should not be thinking about it in silos.
Mm-hmm.
Engage in exercises like a process mapping or value stream mapping. Make sure the end users, the stakeholders, are bought into what the end to end process looks like. It's also
Correct.
an opportunity for you to standardize your process, remove inefficiencies, and make the process super efficient. The second step, in my opinion, is really making sure what you're trying to automate is standardized, efficient, and has the buy-in of all the users that will be impacted as a result of the change. And in my opinion, that's where the real adoption starts, because you've kind of
Got
brought in the users in the journey. Once you have a good process in place, think about automation. And
it. Mm-hmm.
here, I'm personally a big fan of using agile mindset. I know we
Okay.
are kind of steadily moving away from waterfall mindset. So really thinking
Mm-hmm.
about how do you build an MVP first, a minimum viable product that you can test with the users, get their
Mm-hmm.
feedback on, iterate, and deliver something that's has the inputs already incorporated. So that's what I think is a good third phase of the journey. Now, the fourth logical phase, in my opinion, is great. You have built the automation, it has the insights of the end user. Need to also keep making sure that you're wearing a change management hat. It's critical that
Okay.
you're wearing it along the journey, even more critical once the automation is about to go live. It's one thing to say, to send out an email, say to send out a Slack note, hey, this automation is live, go use it.
Okay.
Of course, nobody's going to use it, right? There won't be any adoption. You need to
Right.
make sure that once you have the automation in place, you have structures in place to help support the automation. Could be playbooks, could be
Hmm.
UAT trainings,
Right.
could be office
Yeah.
hours, something dedicated to help unblock the technical issues or anything that the end user is facing to make sure that the adoption is good.
Yeah.
And once all this happens, I think the last phase would be obviously reporting out success.
Correct.
And I always encourage the teams to think about reporting success from the quantitative lens, but also the
Hmm.
qualitative lens. It's one thing to say this automation helps saved 120 hours. That
Right.
is wonderful. But also speak what are the users doing with the 120 hours saved. I'm sure they're not sitting idle. They're doing
Yeah.
something with the time that has been saved. Maybe they're spending the time on more strategic work. Call that
Right.
out. So I've kind of summarized a very complex concept in five big steps,
Correct.
but that's what I think is a good anatomy of a successful automation.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned about how finance leaders can actually go ahead and create playbooks and tell their counterparts as to how it should happen, right? How should the automation initiative be accepted? But the way you put together points, right, that kind of acted as a playbook for other finance leaders to go ahead and
Oh,
think
wow.
about their automation initiatives. So yeah, very well put together and definitely align on the entire thought process of how you said this entire automation initiative journey has to happen, as to how it just starts with a simple idea of identifying the problem statement all the way to implementing it and then tracking the right metrics to measure whether or not these initiatives are useful enough or not, right? But that kind of is always a very long process to follow, because for complex automation initiatives, probably for you to measure the output would probably take months or probably a year's time to see whether or not this initiative is a successful one or not, or whether or not we should add on to this and just build upon it, right? But for anyone who is starting up an automation initiative, right, or is just planning to start an initiative, like, could you share some early signals that they can actually count upon, that probably if these are the things that are working out while we are in this journey, then it would make sense for us to run through it? Or do you think always you should trust the process, and if you have identified the core problem, you should move along, complete the journey, and then probably think about whether or not this would be successful? Like, what's your point of view on this?
Oh, absolutely not. I wouldn't say that you
Mhm.
need to just go and just hope that it works. I'm a
Yeah.
big believer of
Correct.
measuring things out throughout the journey. So there are two things that I've seen, right? One is if it improves the end user experience. Now, the
Okay.
improvement of the end user experience could be across any lens, right? It could be
Hmm.
across the people lens, the process lens, or the technology lens.
Yeah.
If you see a impact on the end user experience, and you could just figure that out by talking to the people, the end users might actually be using the product, and even if there's a slight improvement, you might not get into the fancy metrics,
Yeah.
the quantitative metrics, and you're absolutely right, you won't get them until a while, because you
Correct.
once you start using the automation, there are benefits that are realized. So if there's even market improvement on the user experience, I think that's a win. But
Okay.
kind of
Mhm.
honing into your first point, right, one thing that I'm a big fan of is obviously having quantitative metrics, but also what I said, the qualitative, or as I refer to them as the outcome based metrics. So you need to
Okay.
have specific categories in place to which you can always measure. And
Yeah.
now, obviously, your automation might not check mark all the categories, but let's say of the 10 categories that you define, if it checks mark five categories.
Got it. I think what I got from your points is that you should always have like different phases, as you also have put together, that there are like five key steps in any automation initiative, right? Probably if we are able to determine certain checkpoints at the end of every stage, and then probably measure or whether or not we have been able to successfully tick mark those checkpoints.
Very well summarized, man.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, Abhishek, yeah, we'll move on to some other parts or some other interesting aspects of what you do on a daily basis, right? I think your designation itself speaks data governance and strategy, right? So, with that in place, right, and the next question that I have in mind right now is that for any finance transformation or for any automation initiative to be successful, right, data kind of plays the most important role, because if the data is not structured properly, then it creates big barriers in the entire transformation journey, right? So this is my perspective, but from your experience of dealing with data across multiple different like systems or different processes, right? What have you found? Like, how have you seen data governance taken up? Like, do you think this is often overlooked, or do you think even if these have been taken into custody, like there are too many roadblocks that come along the way to getting it right? Like, what's your thought process there?
I actually love this question because
Hmm.
data governance, in my opinion, is where either an automation becomes super successful or the lack of it makes sure that the automation crashes. One perfect analogy whenever I think about governance is the act of you flossing your teeth, right?
Okay.
You don't like it, but it's important, and you know you want to be mindful about it to
Yeah.
avoid any pains down the line. So that's what I always make sure that I tell the teams to make that analogy. Agree, it's not the fanciest part, but it is
Yeah.
such a critical part. In my opinion, it is the backbone of trust.
Yeah.
You need to have good governance measures in place, else,
Hmm.
especially in finance, every dashboard will end up turning into a debate.
Yeah. Right.
One thing that I always get reminded of this. I don't know where I read it, but somewhere maybe Gartner said it that actually governance doesn't slow down your process. It actually makes it much faster by
Okay.
avoiding by you putting in the work up front to avoid any work down the line. And I'd say this is so much critical for finance, especially because
Mm.
one wrong KPI can mean that you have rework, you have
Correct.
escalation, you have executive not trusting the numbers, which in
Yeah.
my opinion is not a good thing. So yeah, I think that's why governance is very critical. And I think you
Hmm.
also touched upon the point that what roadblocks, what issues that
Yeah.
individuals see when starting to
Right.
think about data governance as a measure, right?
Yep.
um, I'd say there are three big things that generally happen for individuals to not really jump onto the governance journey. The first one that I've seen most common is a lot of disjointed tools. What that
Okay.
means is you have your governance landing in systems, and that's great, but it's not part of the systems which the end user is using. For instance,
Okay.
your end user might be using curated data sets. They might be reporting information out of Power BI dashboards or Tableau dashboards. You want your governance to reside in those tools
Yeah.
along the user journey rather than residing in some disjointed tools, because at the end of the
Mm.
day, you making the experience seamless for your user is the most critical part of the adoption of data governance. So
Correct.
I think disjointed tools become such an issue. The second one that I've seen is a lack of ownership. Generally, what happens is when something goes wrong, there is no clear owner defined. And
Okay.
that, in my opinion, is the issue because it's a big hindrance to any governance success that you're trying to achieve. So I always think about the aspect that maybe individuals and teams should really hone in as they start putting the governance checks and balances in place to really have a good data stewardship model in place, clear
Okay.
owners defined so that you can really have that ownership well defined and the governance can be taken care of. And
Okay.
in my opinion, the third one that I've seen is you actually highlighted it very well, right? Many times end user sees it as a red tape. They
Correct.
think about it as a roadblock for the work
Yeah.
that they're doing. It's an
Yeah.
additional next step. I don't want to do it. Why are they making me do it? But I think the change in that mindset is very much important. Really
Okay.
making sure that you help the users understand how putting in the work upfront really saves you so much work down the line by avoiding rework and maybe bringing in the governance leaders, the business users in one forums. That's what we have
Mm.
seen in the past work really well.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd say if I have to like summarize it in one thing, I'd say it's you don't need a very powerful governance model. What you really need is a useful governance model. You want
Got
to
it.
meet the users where they are, and that's what will make your governance model really stick.
Understood. I think you already cleared. I had a follow up question to this while you started talking about data governance because that just popped up to my mind, but you have already cleared it because the same thought came to my mind as well that when you're thinking about setting up your data governance in place, right, that in most of the cases can create an illusion that this could slow up the things, right? but you have already made it clear that even the Gartners of the world are saying that if you have this in place, then this would just help you accelerate the process. Rather than you figuring out the errors later on, you are able to identify those upfront, due to which you do not have any laggards or any hindrance during the entire process of any transformation project that you're moving towards. So that's very well put together, Abhishek.
Very concise,
Correct.
man. I think you should be on the other side giving podcast.
Yeah, with this thought, right? There's another thing that is just coming to my head is that we at FinFlow, right, the company there where I work at, we also follow the same analogy that you gave, right? That it is very important for the data to reside in systems where the user is going to use it, right? Or where they spend their time, rather than it to reside into systems for which they will have to make an extra effort to get into that tool to extract the data, right? So just to give an example in this case, right, what we have also seen, like this was a problem that we saw that existed in the market, that whenever there's a customer onboarding that has to happen, right? And if we think about the credit review process that goes behind a customer onboarding thing, right? Majority of these times, the frontline person who is dealing with this customer is the salesperson, right? But the data that is required for them to onboard a customer, those could be on the lines of credit terms or credit period, right? This resides with the finance team. Now, the single source of truth for any salesperson is always a CRM, but the single source of truth for a finance person has always been an ERP. And this created a big gap in the decision making process of onboarding a customer. So what we thought of is that if we are able to bring the data between a CRM and ERP together, I think there would be nothing better than that, because CRM is the platform where salespeople are going to go ahead and take the decision. So what we did is we just went ahead and made a trigger that whenever there is a new customer onboarding that is happening, it sends a trigger to FinFlow. FinFlow fetches existing data from the ERP if it's already available about the customer. And if it's not, it actually integrates with other data providers like the credit bureaus, which could be of the worlds of Moody's, which could be DNB, right? Pulls this information and then does all the manual math and then pushes these credit term recommendation, credit limit recommendation directly to the CRM, so that now the person who was taking a decision, who had to follow up with the finance person to get this data, is able to now take his own decisions, and there is, and the connectivity increases in this entire process, right? And we've seen that this has been super helpful for sales teams, not only sales teams but also the finance teams, because finance teams always ended up kind of becoming a support function for the sales team to make a decision, right? But there is much more strategic work that they can handle rather than just like answering the requests of salespeople who just want to onboard a customer, right? So with this entire thing where you said about data governance, right? The same thing we follow at FinFlow as well, and that really transforms the way companies think about their transformation initiatives. Yeah. So just
That's
wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
point. No, that's a very critical pain point. Kudos on that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. So we'll move on and we'll just get to the next chapter of this discussion right now. Right. We've talked about data governance, we've talked about a lot of automation initiatives, right? But if we look at all of this, the core of all of this is obviously going to be technology, which has been evolving over the past decades, right? So, and you have spent an extensive amount of time witnessing this entire evolution of technology in the finance landscape, right? So, what is your point of view here? You have seen traditional systems, legacy systems exist where like people just moved from like paper records to digital records to analytics tools to now probably like depending on AI powered platforms to give them the insight so that they do not have to do the manual math. They do not have to like have like five resources looking through like tons of data to figure out those insights, right? So with this, while this has happened, how have you seen this transition take place in your personal experience?
It's so interesting, right? The speed at which the tech is transforming, especially with the
Correct.
advent of the chat GPTs of the world,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
It is growing really well. As you might have heard, and I'm not the first person speaking it, but finance typically has been a function which is a little slow in adopting innovation or the fanciest tech tools for all the
Mm-hmm.
right reasons, right? Finance deals with highly sensitive information. the repercussions of doing something wrong are much, much higher for finance, I would say. But the journey has been evolving. And if I have
Right.
to summarize how the tech stack has evolved, I
Mhm.
would say we as a finance group have moved from what I call the systems of record, which
Okay.
is what happened. So your static reporting, systems of insight, what's happening right now, more dynamic reporting, real time reporting, your
Hmm.
dashboards. Now towards more system of intelligence, which is like
Right.
gonna happen, the scenario planning, the forecast analysis, your AI
Hmm.
embedded dashboards. I feel that transition has been super helpful as end users try to adopt and is really helping finance, like you rightly quoted, be a strategic partner to the broader business,
Right.
which is a great transition, I would say. If I have to also say that the transformation, and I think that's been the theme of our chat throughout till now, right? That the
Right.
transformation isn't just the tech stack. The transformation is actually happening across the people, process, and technology lens. People, in
Right.
my opinion, are definitely becoming more tech savvy. They're becoming the power users of the world. And an
Hmm.
instance of that is the financial analysts are not just spending their time downloading the reports, but rather they are creating workflows, they're creating
Yeah.
automations, maybe using low code, no code tools, which I think is a great for finance. The processes are definitely becoming far more real time, far more agile, and really moving away from the typical quarter end that finance used to work in.
Right.
And the tech, like we spoke about, more democratized, more AI ready, more self service. So it's an exciting transformation to be a part of across the lens. And that's what
Yeah.
I think I've seen as the evolution of finance transformation.
That's amazing. I think you just briefly touched upon people, process, and technology, right? So, with that, one thought that emerged to my mind is that when there are these three systems that are in place that have to work in tandem for any initiative to succeed, right? How do finance leaders, to be specific, actually go about making a decision on whether to adopt to something new or optimize what's already in place? How do you think, like, how have you taken this decision? Because I'm sure you must have faced this in your career a lot of times.
I think that's a very good question. And it really requires a little more analysis where you really, I always stick back to don't worry about having the fanciest tool in the market. What's important is
Hmm.
what business problem you're trying to solve, what outcome you're trying to achieve. One thing that I'll
Hmm.
share, and one thing that I've seen happen multiple times, I've
Hmm.
seen many complex transformations built on the fanciest of the tools, had zero adoption because the users were important. But there were simple, snappy automations built on using simple low code, no code technologies, which was super successful because the individuals really took care of what business problem we are trying to solve, what outcome we're trying to achieve. And I feel that is very, very critical. You honing in on business problem, the
Hmm.
outcome is far more critical, and that actually helps decide everything down the line, whether you use the existing tech stack that exists, whether you
Hmm.
buy a new thing or use a combination of it. I think all
Okay.
three options are great if you really start thinking about the business problem. So I always kind of keep coming back to that because honestly, that is the crux of how you start making these decisions, and everything becomes pretty easy after that.
Correct, correct. So, Vishek, with what you said right now, there's another thing that's coming to my mind is the build versus buy analogy, right? Do you like translate the same thought process that you have for whether to adapt something new or optimize, or do you think there's some sort of difference in the thought process that goes on over there?
I'd say it's kind of same, but then your build versus
Mhm.
buy analysis, definitely you have to have a broader set of stakeholders in the discussion, in the picture, right? You're not the only one who is part of the discussion, so you want to kind of make sure you're bringing your tech team along the journey, and then really doing analysis and really thinking about it's not again the intent is seamless end user experience,
Right.
and if the tech
Yes.
helps solve it, I think let's jump into it. But really honing it onto the user experience, and that's what I'm trying to improve. Obviously, there are budgetary concerns, which is more
Correct.
of a which is definitely a big concern in general. But I always keep thinking, stick to the outcome, stick to the business problem, and that helps decide a lot of pieces. And obviously, right, I think
Mhm.
what's also very critical is you really ensuring that you are in touch with your end user, in touch with their
Okay.
problems, doing those retrospectives to make sure that you really understand the pain points And along the journey, you're helping solve those pain points, because what will happen is if there are too many pain points, the adoption is going to fall down.
Okay. Yeah, very well put together. But I think it's all about just summarizing what and the why and not how exactly you're doing it, right? Because
That's right.
at the end, these are the levers that are going to drive the outcome, right?
Yeah. The means to an end.
Correct. I think we are pretty much into the end part of the conversation. But before we actually wrap it up, there's one question that I would love to know your thoughts on is see, right now, as you also pointed out, after the advent of ChatGPT, I think the entire world has gone towards adapting different forms of AI solutions. But there is always like demystifying it and then moving beyond just the buzz of AI to actually using it into real world applications, right? So right now, how are you thinking about like software buying decisions? Like, or how are you thinking, how are your peers, in your opinion, thinking about prioritizing these buying decisions? Do you think AI is like a real line item in the budgets for finance teams, or do you think it's still in its very nascent stage and there is still room for it to grow before it kind of becomes a necessity for teams to go ahead and adapt? Like, what's your thought on that?
That's a great question and so relevant in the times we are living in, right? I would say the answer is actually somewhere in the middle. By no
Okay.
means it's just a buzzword. I think people are
Mm-hmm.
talking about it, it's pretty critical.
Right.
But we're not there yet where
Mm-hmm.
it's a real line item on the budgets, right? I'll say what I've seen is mostly is the teams are not saying, hey, let's just go buy AI. What they're saying is, let's have the foundations in place or have the structure in place for AI readiness.
Right.
Let me just
Right.
expand on that thought of what AI readiness actually means, right? It's you really thinking about getting your foundations right, having a
Mm-hmm.
clean, structured data sets, having governance embedded in it to how you rightly mentioned, at a place where the user is actually using the product, and having clean, standardized processes, automations in place. So,
Right.
really building a good foundation is what is happening right now. And it's basically the smart teams, right? They're not really worried about, they are definitely marching towards the AI journey, but
Mm-hmm.
ensuring that the foundations are in place for it to really support the AI and the predictive modeling. And
Right.
what I've also seen is it's something that it's pretty common discussion, right? It's what if you do not have a good foundation in place, AI might be an accelerator to literally nowhere. You don't know where you're going because the foundations are wrong. So
Right.
I'd say it's the investment is more on AI readiness just
Mm-hmm.
yet. I'm sure it's with the speed at which we are marching, it's going to change. But as of today, I think it's more on AI readiness, far from just a buzzword. It's a very critical element, but getting the foundations right is a big piece for the teams.
Oh, that's
However,
good.
I'd also
Yeah.
say
Mm-hmm.
that there is a big advent of individuals and teams using the Gen AI pilot, the Copilot feature within the Power BI dashboards, using simple chat GPTs of the world to really brainstorm a problem, think through a
Mm-hmm.
technical solution, somewhat like the vibe coding in the
Yeah.
engineering world, right? Teams really start using chat GPT to really get an idea of the problem and get a solution, get a head start, so to speak. So that's really happening, but the foundations are being built broader AI initiatives.
Okay. I think when you said that data is like the single most important factor that has to be in place for any initiative to actually even begin, right? That's the same thing that we also advocate at FinFlow, because before starting any implementation with a customer who might have had like months of issues into their particular processes, what we always advocate is just to fix the data first. Because if you're not able to fix the data, then the entire AI or ML layer that would be built upon the wrong data will never be able to give you the right outputs. So it's always better to spend some time to get the data right and then move towards any like automation initiatives or any sort of transformation initiatives, right? But very interestingly, you said that even you as well as your team is using Chat GPT to do certain daily tasks from a finance perspective, right? Like I obviously spend I think 30% of my time on ChatGPT and probably do majority of my repetitive tasks via ChatGPT. At least the thought provoking like conversations that I can have that gives me the ideas, right? So from a finance perspective, how do you use it? That's a very interesting angle that is like just picking my brain. So I just want to know from you.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah.
I'm not really the core finance person, right? I'm more of the
Hmm.
mid of the tech and the
Correct.
finance.
Correct.
So really we
Yes.
use a lot to really think through the tech transformation piece of it. In my early
Hmm.
days, even when I'm solving or helping someone on my team, there are times
Okay.
when I use it to really brainstorm a logic. Maybe I'm trying to do a logic on Power BI.
Okay.
Really
Got it.
using it to brainstorm a logic, I think that's
Hmm.
what I use. So yeah, I have been a big user of it, still continue to be. I love the technology. So I always feel, right, if you have a technology, why not use it to your advantage?
Definitely. I think just one final question that just came in to my mind is, do you think whenever there is, for example, when there were spreadsheets that were in place, right? Then came the real-time dashboards that were able to manage all this data that were on spreadsheets, and then you could just use templates to go ahead and figure out that insight. But that still needed like those two or three people at the lower level who would run through these dashboards to give the insights to finance leaders, right? But now that AI powered solutions are in place, it has become super easy for a finance leader to just probably ask a couple of questions or ask for an insight that they are looking for, and they get the answer out of the AI, right? So with this being in place, do you think even when a finance team is going towards a technology investment, the ROI expectations are also higher? Do you think that they would want to like get more out of the solution because the technology is more advanced, or do you think they are still having the mindset of waiting it out for a certain while to think about the ROI? How is it?
Especially in finance, there's a big push
Mm,
about getting the ROI. And most
okay.
importantly, putting in checks and balances in place to measure the ROI. I think
Hmm.
that's more critical. I was actually, you bring up a very good point, and there was this recent chat that I saw between Mark Zuckerberg and Dela on
Okay.
really the advent of how AI is and how these two big shots are really thinking about AI. And I think they reiterated the same point. The speed at which it is going, it is so critical that you come along the journey. And even when teams think about the tech tools, you actually
Hmm.
are perfectly right. The expectation is to have all the features in place. And that's how even these tools are evolving. The features that they have today weren't available 2 years
Right.
before.
Yeah.
They're also speeding up at that process. And I think it's just the expectation that you have all those features in place as you think about these tech investments.
Okay, that's very well put together. And I think, Abhishek, it's been an amazing conversation that we have had. I'm sure everyone listening to this episode is going to like walk away with a lot of key insights that you delivered right from your 5 step process of how you go about a finance transformation project, all the way to your perspective on how teams are right now using AI solutions, or how at least they're thinking about making those buying decisions, right? So super insightful. Like, I would like to thank you again for joining this conversation today. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And for everyone tuning into this podcast, please stay tuned. The episode is going to release real soon. But until then, keep hooting for finance, keep hooting for technology and AI. Thank you so
And
much. Yeah.
yeah, thanks, Overseas. Before I
Yeah.
can just add one more thing to it.
Sure.
First,
Yeah.
kudos to you and your team for doing such amazing work. I checked out the
Thank you.
previous podcast. The energy, the quality was so high. So great work on driving this initiative. So yeah, and again, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here and for all the insightful conversation that we had. Thank you again.
Thank you, Abhishek. It was exactly the same pleasure. Have a great
All right.
day. Yeah. Bye
Have a good
bye.
one. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.